Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Day in History, our nightly look back at a specific day in history, where we take a look back at the events of that day, the historic context in which those events took place, and the historic ramifications of those events. As always, if you have not yet, please hit the subscribe button, the bell notification to be alerted anytime I post new content, and tell a friend. And without any further ado, this day in history, April 1st. And on this day, in 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act. This law, among other things, added the Surgeon General's warning to every pack of cigarettes sold in the United States effective January 1st, 1971. And the law had severely limited the advertising of cigarette and tobacco products, effective January 2nd, 1971. The cigarette ad exemption for one day was due to concerns from tobacco producers and television broadcasters and radio broadcasters that they might lose out from precious ad revenue during college bowl games on January 1st. The last television commercial in the United States for cigarettes was shown at the very possible last minute on January 2nd, 1971 at 11:59 Eastern Time on the Johnny Carson Show. And it was by Virginia Slim. This law had limited effects at the outset because the warning was very vague on the pack of cigarettes. There was a law that was passed in Congress in 1984 that really set forth the Surgeon General's warning we have today on cigarettes. And it also, they had to go in the early 90s and change print advertising for cigarettes because the cigarette companies, specifically the Camel Corporation, if you remember, Joe Cool was a comic book character that Camel Cigarettes created as a marketing ploy to adolescents, and a study in the early 90s showed that more young adolescents recognized Joe Camel than recognized Mickey Mouse, and Camel targeted children for smoking. So congratulations, Camel, on that one. But it raised awareness of the dangers of smoking cigarettes to a larger mass. This had been growing since the early 60s, specifically a 1964 study, and really built upon that and codified it into law, the federal government's position on this. There were times in the 50s, even up to the 60s, where you would have cigarette companies have doctors, medical doctors, go on television and say 9 out of 10 doctors agree that this cigarette's the best cigarette and healthiest cigarette on the market. Well, those 9 doctors were essentially, I'm sorry to say this, nuts. That 10th doctor that said it's not healthy, he was the one that was right. And these cigarette companies knew the dangers of their cigarettes. They had the data. They had the studies that showed the dangers of these drugs. That's what they are, drugs, nicotine. And they failed to act. And they continued to promote them after they knew it was dangerous, they continued to market them to people, knowing the effects of them, and they tried to push out bogus science that said their products were not deadly and killing people. Much the same way as your big oil companies knew in the late 70s that climate change was occurring, that humans were contributing to it, and that fossil fuels were a major contributor to it. And instead of looking at the time, the rising tide against cigarette companies, especially in the late 80s, when the oil companies could have really did something, and said, you know what? Instead of following down the same path as the cigarette companies, which is what the oil companies did, they funded junk science that said, "Oh, this is just a coincidence," and there's a lot of debate in the scientific community. No, instead of saying, we're going to investigate how to make fossil fuels more effective and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to find out how to... No, they went down the same path that the tobacco company did, and they pushed out junk science that said tobacco's smoke is not harmful, cigarette smoke is not harmful, especially secondhand smoke, when all of it was BS. Well, now, today, that is seen in a horrible light. In fact, even stronger legislation was signed in 2019 mandating a national federal minimum age for the purchase of tobacco products at the age of 21, in line with alcohol. So, good job on that. Births that occurred on this day. In 1973, in the Castro Valley of California, Rachel Maddow was born. Maddow holds a Bachelor of Public Policy from Stanford University. She was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and the Lincoln College. She was the first openly lesbian woman to win a Rhodes Scholarship. In 2001, she was awarded a Doctor of Philosophy in Politics from Oxford. Her dissertation focused on HIV, AIDS, and healthcare reform in American and United Kingdom prisons. After her graduation and studies at Oxford, Maddow would bounce around from some progressive radio stations in the New England part of the United States as a radio host. In 2004, and when Air America, an upstart progressive liberal radio network, launched, she hosted a show called Unfiltered with Chuck D and Liz Weinstead, who was the creator of The Daily Show, co-creator of The Daily Show. And she was really the network radio veteran of the show that kind of helped Chuck D and Liz stay on course. And that show would air for about a year, at which it would be canceled. 2 weeks later, Maddow's own 2-hour show would launch on the network. In June of 2005, Maddow became the regular liberal sparring partner with Tucker Carlson on his short-lived MSNBC show. While Carlson's time with MSNBC is seen by most everyone as a flop, it was a horribly rated program on MSNBC at a time when MSNBC was a very low-rated network. It was one of the lowest-rated shows on the network at the time. Maddow quickly gained a following as a confident progressive counterweight to Carlson, and often outshone him in debates that they had. she would, in 2008, she was hired by MSNBC as a contributor. And by August of that year, she would become a host on the network and has since become one of the chief anchor shows on the network. She hosts the 9 p.m. Eastern Time slot show on the network, which does battle currently with Sean Hannity of the Fox News channel. And he and her often are in a fierce battle for the highest rated show, not only on cable television news, but on cable television. She averages about 3.4 million viewers nightly. Since 2012, she has helped anchor election night coverage on the network, and despite her known political biases, she is often seen as a very fair ball and strike caller in that capacity during the coverage. So, one of my favorite programs to watch on television. I always enjoy her monologues. I always find them to be very informative. They're legendary for how she'll grab one random thing and bring it around to just some, like, wow, I didn't realize that. So I always enjoy that about her show. Some deaths that occurred on this day. In 1839, at the age of 81 in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, Benjamin Pierce died. He was the 2-time governor of New Hampshire, but Mr. Pierce is known more in American history for who he was the father of, and that was the 14th President of the United States of America from 1853 to 1857, Franklin Pierce. I wasn't able to find a lot of information on Mr. Pierce. I will just say this. His son was a horrible president. Not the worst, but probably second. Probably the second worst president this country's ever had. And in reality, is probably more responsible for the Civil War occurring than the actual worst president, James Buchanan. By the time Buchanan became president, the ball and the die really was cast. And Buchanan's allowing the southern states to succeed and really not taking any bold action to prevent it is what gets him that ranking as the worst. But Pierce's policies are the ones that cast that die, in my opinion. So, yeah. That's all for this evening. I'll see you again tomorrow.